If in some way he wasn't dead, then his life after the cross was just a fraud, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, both would have been a fraud. He would have been living a lie. The accounts themselves make so clear that he was dead. There's no possible medical way he could have lived through it. But again, if he didn't die, then still there's no basis or foundation for faith, because what he taught previous and how he lived after, it would have just been a lie. It would have been a fraud. And we mentioned it earlier, the women were witnesses, the first witnesses, the tomb is empty, and that's remarkable. This was completely countercultural. Women had secondary status. They weren't even qualified to be a legal witness in court. You couldn't have a woman's witness, and yet the gospel writers put them first. You never would write it that way. And it points to the reliability, that it's not legend, that it's not fabricated. It points to they weren't trying to make this a beautiful story. They were just telling what happened. And then at the end of the book of John, he shares that when he and Peter came to the tomb, they found the grave clothes laying down, and they found the headcloth folded. And again, that's like remarkable. No robber would come in and take the body and make sure, okay, let's unwrap all the clothes, we'll lay them out, we'll stop and fold the headpiece. He just wouldn't have done that. Jesus' body, when we talked about what torture it was put through, but it would have been so bloody that the rags would have just torn off. You couldn't have laid them out. It wouldn't have been possible. You just have shreds of cloth. And then no robber's going to stop and say, okay, I need to pick up the headpiece and fold it back and set it back down. And you wouldn't even conceive of something like that. But when John and Peter show up, that's exactly what they found. And they just simply recorded, here's what we found. Jesus was there, his body was there, and then he arose, and the clothes just stayed. Mm-hmm. And the cloth was folded to say, this was intentional.
Yeah. Another point that we could make is that if the tomb was not empty, everybody would have known it, because you could point out, hey, this is the body, where is it? Where it was laid. But I think throughout the story of the history of the church, we have like so many songs that have been written about the empty tomb, because you couldn't point out to the tomb where Jesus was laid and say, hey, his body is still there, or the remaining,
right,
the remainder of, but it's still, because the tomb was empty, and Jesus was executed right there at Jerusalem publicly. It clearly died, and the tomb would have been accessible, like people would know where exactly. And it would have been clear that if the body was, stolen there, was still there,
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great point, Jackson. It was recorded a bunch of times in Scripture. Acts 2:24 cites the empty tomb. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the empty tomb. And then there's many other references. All the Gospels talk about the empty tombs. But the gospel truth was based on, and those verses are based on resurrection, based on Jesus rising again. If the tomb wasn't empty, this was such a public thing. I mean, the crucifixion was public. This was right on the road that led to Jerusalem. People would have passed by. People would have been there. The tomb was not far away. People would have had access and known, well, that's Joseph's tomb. I mean, it was a marked thing. It wasn't some hidden, taken away miles away so that no one would ever know. This was all public. And so if Peter stands up and he says in Acts chapter 2, Jesus arose. He was not in the tomb. He is alive. And he says that to the whole thousands of people that he's speaking to in Jerusalem. And he says that someone could have easily just stood up in the crowd and said, What are you talking about? The body's still there. The tomb's still there. It's not empty. But this public thing, there was a public tomb. There was a public execution, and the stone was closed, and the guards were there, and the seal was put on the tomb. And then Sunday morning, the stone rolled away, and it was open, and anybody could have come, and anybody could have seen, and anybody could have looked in and said, "There's the clothes. There's no body." And so no one claims this. I mean, no one stands up in this time period, not even the Jews. The Jews said, "Oh, they stole the body." They understand it wasn't there. It's missing. And the Christians, no one that was maybe a skeptic of that. I mean, sure, there were skeptics. There's people that didn't believe in God. No one stood up and said, "Hey, the body's still in the grave. Come on, guys, you can't pull this one off," because it wasn't there.
Yeah, there was nobody to deny that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, how about the eyewitnesses that claim that they saw Jesus after the resurrection? Could they have been lying?
Yeah, so Jesus died, he was buried, he was guarded, the tomb was found empty, so we're kind of build the evidence as we go along, right? And then the eyewitness accounts point to the reliability, just how they reported it. But it's still amazing to think of someone could come back to life. That's not really the way death works. So could the eyewitnesses of the people and the accounts, and could this have been a lie? After the empty tomb, and the resurrection is so important to our faith. It's logical. The evidence points to the empty tomb, but Jesus didn't leave it at that. He showed up. He met people. He talked to people. He interacted with people, and he made clear that he was alive. Could that all have been a lie? It would have had to have been a lot of people lying. A lot of eyewitnesses that saw Jesus. And he didn't leave it to guesswork. He didn't leave it to rumors. He actually showed up and talked with people and met them.
Yeah. Now, we're talking about like eyewitnesses. Who are some of the people who actually saw him?
Sure, yeah. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So all the Gospels record that Jesus appears to the women. He appears to the disciples on multiple occasions. He appears to many other people. And John 20 talks about Jesus interacting with Mary very specifically in the garden, face to face. Luke 24 talks about two disciples on a road to Emmaus, and Jesus comes alongside and walks with them, talks with them. Eventually they sit down and they have dinner, and he shares with them. He breaks bread with them. He drinks with them. And then they realize who's been with them all along, as he had been talking about Scripture, explaining the truths of the Bible. But he went to them directly, and they saw him. He meets with the disciples in the upper room, and is there with them, eats with them, has them see the marks of the crucifixion. And in John 21, Jesus shares breakfast with the disciples again, shares forgiveness with Peter, and you have these personal interactions. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul reports that over 500 people saw Jesus after his death and resurrection. Paul was one of the people persecuting Christians early on. Maybe he had this list of 500 people that he was going to try and track down, because one of his goals would be to debunk the resurrection, to take the legs out of this new faith of Christianity. He wanted to destroy Christianity. And yet he realized that over 500 people have been impacted by seeing Jesus directly.
Yeah, the last one is a very interesting one, because Paul was not one who was actively working with Jesus throughout his time.
Not at all.
He had God had like a special consideration for Paul. Yes. Even after that, he says, "Well,
pulls him in later on." Yeah,
yes, definitely. And that's quite a list of appearances, though. Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that all these eyewitnesses, they didn't immediately recognize Jesus. So it's not how someone would write a legend. I think anybody in the story wants to be that hero that says, "Oh, that's Jesus, I know him," and yet nobody nobody recognizes him right away. Later on they do, after they talk with him, after they interact with him, after they eat with him, and they start to put things together, and then they, oh, that's who it is. But eventually they do. They see the evidence, they see the nails, they see the piercing. Jesus shows them the reality of the crucifixion, and he shows them the reality of who he is. But he's changed, and that comes out through these interactions. So you have people seeing a new, a strong, a healthy, yes, been hurt by the crucifixion and has the marks to show it, but he is not what they immediately would recognize as a crucified Lord. I mean, maybe they don't recognize him because they're thinking of what he looked like on the cross.
Not that I want you to get too deep into that, but if you want to mention a little bit, like, because it's interesting, the scars have to be there because they actually, Jesus doing his intercessory, his priestly duty for us. He shows the scar for us to the Father. But like, it's interesting the way you're saying that they would recognize, because I bet like he was beaten before during the execution, but it was
beyond recognition, and he was horribly beaten and tortured, and
but after
bloodied, and so the last time they saw Jesus, his body had been abused and tortured and bloodied and ripped apart. And now he's on the road with these two men, healthy, ready to go, and they don't initially recognize him. It's like he's Jesus, but he's the best version of human Jesus, beyond what he was on earth, and certainly not what he looked like on the cross. And he bears the marks, he bears the scars, but he is healed, and he is created anew, and he is a resurrected Jesus.
Yeah, this is certainly not Jesus revived, from fainting and trying to live and recover some sins after, like,
right.
You like when they discharge you from the hospital, you still have to recover,
Yeah. Think of a crucified Jesus that somehow fainted and then came back to life and stumbles into the upper room, dragging his body behind him, and a trail of blood, and they, at that point, I don't see the disciples becoming hopeful. They might hide him, they might help him recover, but he obviously didn't have power over the grave. He just narrowly escaped it. It doesn't give you strength to know your teacher, your leader, your Lord is in the other room, just struggling to somehow survive. But that's not how Jesus approaches them. That's not how he shows up. He shows up in full strength and vitality, and a new body that is able to do more than what his former physical body could do. It talks about him being able to walk through walls. Him not initially recognized because there's something special about this new body. Bears the marks, but certainly wasn't a beaten and bruised person that just happened to come back awake again. Jesus is strong, healed, corrected, and someone that every time someone sees him, he brings them hope. He brings them strength to their life. And a broken Jesus from the cross would not have brought hope. It would have brought pity.
I am that's my job. I don't want a savior like that. I want a savior, on the other hand, who is actually
conquers the grave.
And I think the book of Hebrews has enough promises what type of priest that we have. First, and Christ is the best resources that we could ever hope for. even after we come to Christ, whatever we're facing, we can always go to Him. Like it says, we do not have like a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness.
Yeah.
But one he's been through all that, but he's without sin, and he's standing with us, and we know what type of high priest, and he's not a human priest, but he's God and flesh. So we can always
been through all that and more
Yes.
than what we have.
Yeah.
Struggled through it and overcame it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Now, well, we could probably go on longer, but it's time to wrap up. That this has been very fascinating to me, and
it's an amazing topic, and you're right. We could go on longer. I want to bring up one final, I think, important piece of evidence, and we just kind of touched on it earlier. But regarding those witnesses, we know Jesus died. He was buried. The tomb was then empty, and then witnesses saw him alive. And the what if they lied idea, I think, just to bring that back up and tie it back around, I think the biggest piece of the puzzle is the change that happens in those witnesses' lives. Jesus brings them strength, brings them hope, brings them a vitality and a new mission and a new desire to take this Christianity and spread it around the world. That doesn't happen if he's dead. It doesn't happen if he's a bloody mess in the back room. It doesn't happen unless he truly rose again. And you think about the disciples, and I think they're the best example of that, because Jesus finds them huddled and scared, locked away in the upper room. He finds them hiding from the authorities. They don't see the crucifixion and then run right out and say, we're here for Jesus, we follow Jesus, we want to tell everyone about Jesus. No, they hide in the room because they don't want to be crucified too.
Yeah.
They're not quite sure if they can associate with this guy. They still believe, they still have their faith, they're struggling, but they're hiding. And Jesus comes to them. They're not sure they can take their faith public at this point. But after they see Jesus, all bets are off. After they see Jesus alive and after they see Jesus changed, they go public. And the book of Acts kind of just explains that, how each one of the disciples go public, they testify, they proclaim Jesus' life, his resurrection, and they are willing to go to jail, they're willing to be beaten, and they don't back down. And they claim he rose again, and they're willing to give their lives for it. History will go on to say that every single one of Jesus' disciples, all 11 of them, will die for their faith, will die for the resurrection, and then eventually Paul as well. If you were a liar, if you knew Jesus died, would you be willing to die for the lie that he rose again? I wouldn't do that. And I think that's the same thing. If it was a lie, would they have the courage to step up with their feet, with their story? If they knew their leader died, would they continue to believe what the leader said? Would they instead think maybe that message was powerless? Would you keep proclaiming a message that you knew that had no truth and no basis and was a lie, and proclaiming it to the point of willing to give up your life? I wouldn't do that. I would just let it go. I know it would hurt. There'd be pain. You would remember the past. You would miss your friend, but I'd let it go. And yet the disciples, they latch on tighter and tighter, and they get closer, and they get more passionate, and they turn the world upside down. And every single one of them give their lives for that message.
Now, one thing that is jumping out of what you're saying is that's kind of like the birth of the gospel. We know, God predicted the gospel since the book of Genesis, but with Christ coming, from resurrection, and that's actually the foundation of our gospel. It's like Peter would run away, And actually, man, I can put my life into on the line for that, because
Yeah.
and that's actually the Bible says that the gospel is power, and actually the disciples, they were empowered by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They're like, okay, you want to
Yes.
kill us, so you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Stephen, like he says, oh God, forgive them, because they don't even know what they're doing, because like the gospel like should empower you, you know, to you push with boldness. I mean, from time
Yeah.
to time, as Christian, we're not perfect. We should always ask, like the Apostle Paul, but should empower us, give us courage, like to
Yeah.
share the gospel and be, because this is not just a myth. It's not like
Yeah.
up in the air. It's something that, hey, we can really, like you put it one day, you put all your eggs in one basket. We can really like
Yeah.
pay
It's
our
the only
life
way.
on it.
That's
Yeah.
what faith is. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Peter's a great example because he took off in the garden and he was afraid, and then he denied Jesus multiple times. But after he knows Jesus is alive and after he sees the resurrection, he is one of the boldest disciples, and he'll go on to lead thousands of people to Jesus, turn the world upside down, and yet eventually would give his life for Jesus, be crucified upside down, not willing to be crucified in the same way. Didn't feel that he could. He didn't want to be respected enough to be crucified the same as Jesus. But each one, the disciples put on trial, imprisoned, beaten, expelled from the synagogue, expelled from the temple, stoned, beheaded, tossed, their bodies tossed off of the temple, crucified, slain by spears, exiled. I mean, that's just, it runs the gamut, right? And they did that because they knew it was true. They saw it. It changed their lives, and they were going to make sure everybody knew it, so they could have changed lives too.
Yes, definitely. Well, thanks for your time, Pastor Juan. That's been great, you know. Do you have any book recommendation for us?
Sure. The last time we got together, I mentioned Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Faith, and he really looks at what does faith mean. But another really important book, if you want to learn more, it's really impacted me, is The Case for Christ. And Lee Strobel, he was an atheist. He wanted to disprove the resurrection. That's the whole point of his journey there. But he writes down his journey of looking at the manuscripts, the eyewitnesses, the gospel accounts, the just psychologically, medically, all through the evidence, and he looks at it, and his goal was to disprove the resurrection, but he ends up believing in that very resurrection. Can't discount the truth that he finds in The Case for Christ. Excellent book. If you want to learn more about any of those things, you want to dive into this topic a little deeper, that book would be a great one. There's another book called Cold Case Christianity, and it's written by a detective, actually a cold case detective, who goes in and he looks at the eyewitnesses from a law enforcement perspective and says, how does this line up? They're done from different perspectives. Is, from our evaluation as a law enforcement officer, can I get to truth here? And he does a great job of looking at those witnesses. Again, if you want to dive in, learn a little bit more, his is a heavy book. It's a deep book, but a great look at the gospel accounts.
Yeah, well, Pastor, I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I feel good, like, you know, for all the time like we spent, like we took a break. So
it's good to jump back in.
That was a good material. I really appreciate you. Have a good one.
Yeah, that kind of wraps up this season.
Yeah,
where we're looking at faith, looking at the gospel.
Yeah.
And the resurrection is the key linchpin to the gospel. So great way to wrap up.
Yes, definitely.